Welcome to tonight's public lecture at St. Photios Orthodox Theological Seminary. Today's keystone presentation will be by Father Innocent, one of the monastics who is also a student at the seminary, and God willing will be graduating this upcoming weekend. And today's topic is Hinduism. This is a topic that was originally covered in the comparative religion class, which is a survey of non-Orthodox Christian denominations, as well as major non-Christian religions. I'm very grateful that Father Innocent has chosen to share with us this presentation, as the topic is becoming increasingly relevant, both from a pastoral perspective, as well as providing a basic understanding for any Orthodox Christian to be able to have an intelligent and intelligible conversation with a potential inquirer from a Hindu background, and be a good and better witness for the Orthodox faith. So again, this is a keystone presentation, and I'd like to invite Father Photios, the Dean of the seminary, to give a brief overview of what a keystone presentation is, after which we'll invite Father Innocent to proceed.
Your Eminence, faculty members, visitors, guests, students, welcome to tonight's Keystone Lecture. Keystone projects are overarching assignments which enable students to show mastery over broad areas of study corresponding to the 5 program-specific objectives of the Bachelor of Theology program. Students are required to complete all Keystone projects by the end of their final year. The third of these Keystone projects is a public lecture on a theme either drawn from one or more of the following areas in general studies: history, literature, science, comparative religion, or philosophy, or on a topic of personal interest to the student. This particular assignment is designed to fulfill the following 2 program-specific objectives, such that the student demonstrates, first, an appreciation of the role of Christianity, and especially the Orthodox Church, in the historical, intellectual, and cultural development of mankind, and secondly, an understanding of the world around us from Orthodox Christian perspective. The student selects a suitable topic in consultation with faculty members who work with the student in a mentoring capacity, helping him or her to refine the topic, to structure the lecture, to ensure clarity of presentation, and to generate suitable audio-visual resources. Although the Keystone Lecture is not intended to be specifically theological in nature, the student is expected to expound on his or her topic within the broader context of Orthodox theology and to set forth the ramifications of the topic for contemporary church life. This Keystone assignment also affords the student an excellent opportunity to demonstrate his or her communication skills, which he or she will be able to put to good use in the future when serving the church in a clerical or teaching capacity. The topic of tonight's lecture by Father Innocent is Hinduism, so I invite Father Innocent to come to the podium.
Your Eminence, Fathers, Mother, fellow students, honored guests, Christ is risen. First of all, I have to ask your forgiveness. Due to our technical glitch at the beginning, it seems that the fonts in my presentation have been changed, so they might be sort of out of alignment, but that's what we'll have to deal with. So as you have been informed, our topic for this evening is Hinduism. Hinduism is said to be the world's oldest living religion. It is thought that what we today call Hinduism goes back in a fairly continuous tradition, at least maybe 1,500 years ago. Oh no, forgive me, 1,500 years before Christ. Some argue even earlier, depending on how you want to define Hinduism and their tradition. As Alexei told us, Hinduism is usually ranked with the 5 major world religions: Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism. As has been said, our goal here is to give some sort of explanation, definition, overview of what Hinduism actually is, which, as we will see, owing to its very nature, is rather difficult to do in a limited amount of time, but we're going to try our best. And then, of course, to provide some sort of evaluation of it from an Orthodox standpoint. So our first step in trying to understand this is going to require a geography lesson. You may know we're somewhere over here in California. We have to jump way across over here to the land of India. Now, today it's Pakistan, but if you look up in the northwest here, there is a very large river named the Indus River, which flows into the Indian Ocean. You see right around here. So around this river arose a very long time ago. The dates I saw said maybe perhaps going back to the 3rd millennium BC, a civilization. They usually just call it the Indus River civilization or something like that. One theory, I don't know if it's universally accepted, but one theory is that a certain group, which are termed the Indo-Aryans, departed some ancient time from the Caucasus Mountains, near around Georgia and Russia, that area, and on horseback, and they settled in various places, groups spreading out, and one was this Indus River. They settled around this river. They are thought to be responsible for what we call the Indo-European language family, which includes Sanskrit, which is the language, the ancient language of the Indians, the Hindus, but also ancient Greek, which is interesting. And some words from this are, of course, in our language and Latin and many other languages. So basically, how is this related to defining Hinduism? So we have the Indus River. So the story is, of course, you can accept it or not, but this is the story I've gotten from several sources, is that long ago, this civilization that was on the Indus River, the Persians from nearby, from the west, came over and found them along this Indus River. And either they could not pronounce the name, or they didn't know what to call them. So it was the Indus River, so they called them Hindus. And that's where the word Hindu comes from. And now, the reason this is important for our definition, I mean, it's an interesting linguistic story, but this tells us something about the actual meaning of the word Hinduism. Like I said, it's called the world's oldest religion, but that's sort of a difficult thing to say exactly. So what happened here, we had the Indus River, then we had the Hindus. If you read older British texts, they use the double O, which I find slightly comical, but that's what they called them, the Hindus. And so then we got the word Hinduism from that. So likewise, the word India is obviously based on the Indus River, or the modern language of the Indians is Hindi. You get the idea. The point of this is to indicate that Hinduism, which we said was the world's most ancient religion, is not actually exactly a religion in any kind of discrete sense. It's just sort of a catch-all term for what the Hindus, which is the nation of the Hindus, is people who sprang up from around the Indus River and then later went down into India, what they do. So if you call someone a Hindu, it's almost, in a certain sense, closer to saying, you know, this man is a Greek, closer than that to, you know, this man is a Christian. So this idea of a discrete religion. Hindu is more of a national thing. So similar words to Hinduism you would find would be Judaism and Hellenism. So Judah is the nation of the Jews, Judah. So you have Judaism, and this is the ism of the nation of Judah. Hellenism is the ism of the Hellenes. Now, of course, Judaism is sort of easily identifiable as a religion. It helps that they have just one God, one place of worship, so it makes it easier to do that. I don't think anyone would call Hellenism a religion. If you call someone a Hellene, it's not a comment on their religious belief or practice, really. Hinduism is somewhere in between that. So we could say, in general, that the word Hinduism, not so much a religion, it just refers to their entire culture or their national ethos. But at the same time, you have to bear in mind that their entire culture is completely entwined with their religious practices, beliefs, all of that. So anything from politics to art, just the traditional way of life that you would find in a family or a village. Basically every aspect of Hindu life is imbued with religious significance of some sort, at least according to tradition. Of course, the country of India has become slightly modernized in recent times, westernized, but according to tradition, this is how it would be. instead of Hinduism, if you ask a Hindu what his religion is, he probably wouldn't necessarily say, I'm a Hindu. But what they often refer to their religion as is the Sanatana Dharma. And forgive me, I don't know how to pronounce these Sanskrit words, but I'm going to make an attempt. So what that means is eternal Dharma, which Dharma is translated as, well, in this case, it would mean something like eternal tradition or law. So their whole religious practice and belief system doesn't actually have any founder or central figure, so to speak. No central authority. Neither does it exactly have sort of a formal organization or institutional structure. They do have a priesthood and things like that, but these are traditional, I don't know what you'd call it, not an institution, but it's a tradition of priesthood that's passed down, and not so much what we would think of, like the most obvious example would be like the Roman Catholic Church is an institution of, they also don't really have anything that you would call dogmatic teachings, though they certainly have ideas that are sort of regarded as more orthodox within Hinduism, but there's nothing like dogmas that they teach. So a Hindu could be an atheist, a monotheist, a polytheist, a pantheist, or sort of anything else that you please. In principle, the Hindu religion incorporates all forms of belief and worship without necessitating the selection or elimination of any. Hindus revere the divine in every manifestation, whatever that manifestation may be. The Encyclopedia Britannica calls them doctrinally tolerant. I met an Indian woman once. She said, in India, no one ever actually asks each other, what do you believe? What are your religious beliefs? If they want to talk about religious matters, they only ask, what do you do? What do you practice? They don't ask about beliefs, according to this woman, which goes with what I've read here. However, this is not to say that we sort of have a total chaos and we can't define anything and we're hopeless for a presentation here. There are many unifying elements within Hinduism, and our aim is to just look at very few. There's very many, but we have limited time here. So because the information I gathered comes from Western scholars mainly, I'm going to sort of bring it to you in the way that the West did it first, or if not for the first time, the first very important and significant time, which was in the 17th century. In 1650, Britain set up the East India Trading Company in India, and within a little over 100 years, they had their first governor general in India, and it was incorporated into the British Empire. So for the most part, it's through that relationship that the modern West has got to know the Hindus. Knowledge of them in the ancient West existed, but our knowledge nowadays comes mostly from this relationship with the British. So there's sort of two aspects to what the British found when they went to India. And these are sort of the two images or impressions that we have in the West of Hinduism. So the first thing, what they found immediately being practiced sort of on an everyday basis just by the common people was just a huge amount of gods, images, idols all over the place, sometimes sort of a kind of monstrous kind of character. All kinds of rituals and devotions associated with these images, statues, and so on, which of course were very scandalizing to the good Anglicans of Britain. So at this first encounter, India sort of became known to the West as sort of this a land of pagan darkness and rampant polytheism. So that's the first impression. If you go there in the modern day, this is very recent, you can see from the masks, you would find the same sort of thing going on. They have their images of their gods. They're just totally integrated into their culture. So everything from advertisements, they've got roadside altars, they're everywhere. That's Ganesh. He's a very popular god. This is just an example of some of their religious rituals that you would find going into the modern day. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, these are devotees of the goddess of destruction, Kali. It is thought that during these ceremonies, and they do sort of ritual dances, the dancers are treated sort of with the honor due to the god Kali, who is thought to sort of inhabit them, I guess. I don't know the exact idea, but This, I'm not sure exactly what this ritual is, but going back to the very most ancient Indus River period, they had basically what amounts to fire worship, and they still use the texts for those rituals. So I'm assuming this is associated with that, but I'm not sure exactly what it is. In any case, this was the sort of thing that the British found when they went there, so that's one of our main impressions of just this polytheism and just what we would normally associate with just sort of a pagan culture. They've got many, many gods, and they very much like to worship them in very many ways. But then after that, as the British were getting settled there, something else happened, which is that they discovered the Sanskrit scriptures, which provided basically a completely different picture of what Hinduism is. So instead of this sort of just what they saw as, just this base idolatry, they found what they considered basically to be sort of this most lofty and developed philosophy, metaphysical doctrine, which indeed proclaimed a single God over all things, who is the source and sustainer of all things, above any material conception, and also in these scriptures very developed ascetical teachings and things of that nature. So many Western scholars, after they discovered the scriptures, they sort of came to regard what you find in the scriptures as sort of the true Hindu religion, and disregarded sort of the common thing that they first found there as sort of being a degenerated form, though this position has been hotly contested, and I'm going to try to sort of offer a reconciliation because, well, we'll see as we get to it. I just have some examples of some Western philosophers who were smitten with the Sanskrit scriptures. So this is Arthur Schopenhauer, very distinctive-looking man. He said, "In the whole world there is no study so beneficial and so elevating as that of the Upanishads, which is one of their most important scriptures. It has been the solace of my life, it will be the solace of my death." We get even closer to home. Ralph Waldo Emerson, he said, "In all nations there are minds which incline to dwell in the conception of the fundamental unity. The raptures of prayer and ecstasy of devotion loose all being in one being. This tendency finds its highest expression in the religious writings of the East, and chiefly in the Indian scriptures, in the Vedas, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Vishnu Purana, which are yet more of their scriptures." And Henry David Thoreau, he said, "What extracts from the Vedas I have read fall on me like light of a higher and purer luminary, which describes a loftier course through a purer stratum, free from particulars, simple, universal. It rises on me like the full moon after the stars have come out, wading through some far summer stratum of the sky." That's very poetic. So you can see that they had a very high evaluation of what they found in these scriptures, which seems kind of opposed to those images I was just showing you about some of their other worship. Now, forgive me, it looks like this slide has been defaced in our transfer there. But what I had here, basically their scriptures, this was just a brief overview of what they have, wasn't meant to be exhaustive, is their scriptures are divided into what they call Shruti and Smriti. Shruti literally means something like hearing, and it's considered to be the most authoritative and a direct result of divine inspiration, so it was heard, literally. Smriti are, they're authoritative, but they're secondary, and they sort of derive their authority from the Shruti. One commentator, Shankara, he's a very important Hindu sage, says that Shruti is like immediate intellectual intuition, while Smriti is like inductive logic or reflective consciousness. So what you can't see on our graph here are the Vedas. We saw mention of those in our philosophers there. There are 4 Vedas, and these are the oldest texts which go back to the Indus River period. And they mostly contain basically ritual instructions and hymns and mantras and stuff like things like that. Those are regarded as divinely inspired. Some Hindus actually consider the Vedas to sort of be the most unifying authority of Hindu religion, at least in a material sense. The Upanishads is also classed as Shruti, and this is a sort of exegesis of the Vedas, which gives symbolic interpretations of all the rituals that are described, and also discuss the nature of God and similar other things. The Smriti consists of several, two main ones, 2 mythological epics called the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. Forgive me for my pronunciation. As well as the sutras, which are collections of aphorisms about various spiritual topics, and the Puranas, which have sort of mythological texts, I believe. The Vedas, like I said, are the oldest, going back to 1500 BC. Oh, yes, forgive me. So the first English translation to appear was that of the Bhagavad Gita, which is a part of one of these major epics, the Mahabharata, which appeared in 1775, was the first English translation. That picture on the left there is a scene from the Bhagavad Gita, which is Krishna, who is an incarnation of the god Vishnu, explaining spiritual matters to the warrior Arjuna, who's about to go into battle. And that's sort of been one of the most popular Hindu texts in the West. It's very popular in India as well, but yeah. So their idea of scripture is, it's definitely different than ours. They tend to look at their scriptures in basically a completely ahistorical way. It's divinely inspired. It comes down through to tradition, but it comes down from eternity. So the Shruti is, it's like this, it's supposed to be, like he said, direct, like intellectual intuition, apprehension. It's hard to explain, and of course I don't know perfectly myself, but it's handed down from above and not so much through historical time and their understanding of it. Of course it's passed down, as text and also as oral tradition, but it's understood to be this eternal thing that just sort of exists within the world. That's, this divine presence. Veda literally means knowledge, or something like that, or wisdom. It actually comes from the root vid, as in like video, which is the Latin I see. So it's knowledge, seeing, or the Greek ida, which is I know. So the Vedas are understood to be something that are directly seen and known. The texts don't actually have any historical author ascribed to them. They say that the rishis, who are their sort of ancient sages, received the revelation and transmitted them down, and they were eventually put to text and things like that. But it's this idea of being something eternal, and so authorship is sort of factored out. Where of course, we have this idea, our scriptures are the product of divine revelation, which is of course something that comes down from eternity, but it's always a historical person in a specific historical place and time. So it really turns into a different conception, and that we'll see that difference come up a lot between Hinduism and the way we would look at things. So basically we have these two elements here. We have the scriptures and we have all of these Hindu gods, this polytheism. That's an image, again, of Vishnu with what are called his 10 avatars. If you've heard the word avatar, that comes from this. Those are incarnations of Vishnu, which include a boar and a man-lion. And actually, I don't know if this is universal. I don't know how many things you could say are universal in Hinduism, but they actually believe that the Buddha was an incarnation of Vishnu, which is interesting, which I understand might be contentious to the Buddhists, but I don't know. But anyway, so we have these two elements, this great multiplicity of gods and all these pagan rituals, and on the other hand, we have the scriptures, which seem to be much more philosophically and metaphysically advanced, which at first glance seem like two entirely different things, but from the Hindu point of view, they're actually unified, and I'm going to try to explain how that works, which will be sort of a good way to gain some sort of small understanding or definition of what Hinduism actually is. Oops, I've gone too far. Okay, so I want to just look at some general concepts that form the Hindu worldview. I want to emphasize that these aren't religious dogmas in the sense that we would understand that, but they're really just elements of how Hindus conceive of reality, and they're seen as just implicit in life itself as a reality that exists. So it's not a dogmatic teaching, but it's what there is in their point of view. So the first one is Dharma. It is said that the Dharma is subtle and hard to be understood, but we're going to try to do it. So like I said, the Hindus avoid all dogmas and definitions because these are entirely inadequate to declare the Dharma. A definition is inherently limited. It's enclosed, but the Dharma is not limited or enclosed. This is an important point. The most common translation of Dharma into English is law, and it's a pretty good one. So the concept is something like this. It's like an eternal law that governs all existence, It's a law that is the cause of the being of things and is determinative of their proper activity. So you remember that they call their religion the eternal Dharma. So they see various manifestations of their religious life as being expressions of this eternal law. It's the eternal Dharma. So it's this all-encompassing law that just undergirds the way everything is ordered, or properly ordered. It can also, the term is also used to refer to their written laws and teachings, and it can also just mean the fulfillment of one's duties as an individual, like personal virtues, your duties to your family, to your society, as a member of a certain class, and so on. They also say that Dharma is whatever sustains. To me, and like Father Patapio said, this is not exact theological inquiry, but it's sort of, I think, common to our concept of logos, which is, it's something that governs all creation. It determines what their natural activity is, what their proper, St. Maximus would say, their natural motion, or it determines the structure of things, it sustains them in being, and so on. It brings them into existence. But of course, you have to qualify that pretty strongly, is that in Hinduism, Dharma is not at all something personal. The Logos is a person, Christ. But for Hinduism, it's this impersonal law that just exists. There's not necessarily like a person who is exercising power to accomplish these things, but it's a law or a principle. In fact, some Hindus will even say that God is governed by the Dharma. So they say that the Dharma of God is to create, to sustain, and to destroy. We might get into that later, but and God might be an inaccurate word there. We'll also talk about that. So yes, to destroy, or some prefer to say reabsorb the world in eternally repeated cycles, which they call the yugas. And you should know we're in the last yuga right now, the Kali Yuga, where everything is dissolved and all the dharmas are forsaken. The priests don't make the sacrifices anymore, and the servants rule over the rulers and so forth. But that's the Dharma. And about our picture here is obviously not a picture of Dharma, because that wouldn't be possible. But I thought it was in some way representative of the concept. This is what's called a mandala. And it's sort of this geometric representation of the universe. And they have different ones that mean different things. This one in the center, you see upwards triangles and downwards triangles in the very center. That's the center of the universe. And they have their sort of interposed over each other, are meant to be the male and feminine principles, which I guess they come together, and then you spread out into all four directions of the universe to, I don't know how you would describe that, but it's sort of a depiction. It's not exactly meant to be a depiction of Dharma, but I thought it would be a good image to use, as good as any. So that's Dharma. The next major concepts that we want to look at are what they call karma and samsara. You probably have heard the word karma. You've heard of good and bad karma, which just means, if I do something good will happen to me. If I do something bad will happen to me. Which is sort of correct, but what karma actually means, a literal translation is just action. So any act you take, it has to do with the results of actions. Every action is a cause of a certain effect, but also every action is the effect of a cause. And this is karma. So it has to do with moral issues, but also just action in general, whether or not it has a moral implication. So samsara is basically a development of this. Samsara is sort of the process of karma. So what samsara is, the eternal process of karma, and it literally means a course or a revolution, so it's a cycle. It is basically unending flux and change. It's one cause which leads into an effect, which causes another effect, and that effect is the cause of another effect, and it's basically this eternal cycle. So this describes basically the whole world process as the Hindus conceive it. It's entirely cyclical and non-progressive. So this is like we talked about how they conceive their scriptures before. They have that same sort of idea going on here. There's no history as such. It's a cycle, and it doesn't necessarily proceed from this point to that, as in a, like I said, it's non-progressive, so you end up where you started. So of course, this is opposed to the way we would view things. Time is, it's not just this endless, eternal cycle. We see time in reality more as a linear progression. There's a beginning, there's an end. You know, the creation of the world, there's the incarnation, there's the end of the world. And that's the world as we see it. So this eternal cycle for them is really not pleasant. I believe this is a Buddhist image, but they have the same sort of idea. And you can see it's almost like it's being eaten up by a demon or something. I'm not sure exactly, but it's not exactly a happy thing. It's an eternal cycle in which beings are basically bound by their own desires and attachment to actions and the results of action, so to karma. They're bound by karma in the cycle of samsara. It's sort of an entrapment. It's written in the Upanishads. They say that contingent beings, which would be just everything in the world, it's contingent. Contingent beings are born of food. Once born, they live on food. Dying, they enter food. So it's this idea of eating and being eaten, sort of. You can't see it here. In the middle, they've got this circle of 3 animals eating each other's tails, which I understand has a specific interpretation within Buddhism, but it sort of represents that idea anyway. So, now I did want to note that I think that we could say, in a certain qualified sense, that their idea of samsara has a certain accuracy to it of the fallen world without Christ, in which we are sort of engaged in this cyclical process of corruption. It brought to mind Saint Maximus. He describes our life sort of in the flux of the fallen world as it's a constant search for sensual pleasure and the avoidance of pain. But of course, every pleasure inevitably contains pain within itself. And then that pain leads, we search for another pleasure to avoid that pain, and it creates a same sort of cycle. And that's a description of the fallen state of man. So you could sort of appreciate it if you want to appreciate, but understand what they mean from that perspective, because they are pagans. So it makes sense from their perspective. And of course, the error here is they sort of see the fallen state of man and the whole world as being the eternal state of man and the whole world. This is just what the world is. There's nothing, it couldn't be any other way. And we'll see the implications with that later. So of course, what you've all heard of that follows is just a natural part of that, is reincarnation or transmigration of souls. I don't actually know what the Sanskrit word is. So you've probably all heard of this, but it just follows on these. You have the results of your actions and your attachment to the results. So yourself or your soul is, because of those actions and what follows on them, it's just in this constant cycle of being born into the world, dying, and then being born back into the world to work out the results of its previous actions. You could say in general that samsara is just a process of birth and death, rebirth, death, if you wanted to put it that way. So, now of course this is also something that we have to reject completely. I again won't go into details, but we understand that each human person is comprised, first of all, of a soul in the body. There's no, their idea of a soul, first of all, is different than ours, which I might talk about later, but you can be incarnate as a human, but you can also be incarnate as a god, or an animal, or a demon, or other things like that. It doesn't have, there's no specific nature connected to it. So it's different in that sense. And of course, we understand that each human person is created, his soul and his body, at conception. It doesn't come from a previous existence. And when we die, we leave the world and we remain ourselves, and there's no returning like this. This is an idea that the fathers did have to refute, especially in the context of the Greeks had similar doctrines, and it came up with the Origenist controversies. But the general teaching of the fathers is that a doctrine like this actually just leads, immediately the main problem is it leads to idleness, spiritual laziness, and despair if it's this cycle, and similar spiritual maladies. So that's karma, samsara, reincarnation. So what logically follows upon that is moksha. It's the logical conclusion. So it's said among the Hindus that there are 4 goals to be found among men, and these are sort of in an ascending order. The first they call kama, which is sensual pleasure. After that comes artha, which is the acquisition of goods, and then dharma, which is the fulfillment of duty in this sense. But then finally, and the highest desire is moksha. Those first 3 desires will keep one trapped, entangled in samsara. But the desire for moksha is basically the desire for escape from this whole cycle. So it's escape from karma, samsara, and rebirth. It is translated often as escape, liberation, release, emancipation from time, death, and the flux and changing forms of existence, and things like that. So this is basically the Hindus' version of salvation from the fallen world. It really strongly, I can't go into all the details, of course, but it strongly differs from our idea of what salvation is, and that this is a deliverance basically from existence itself. As we said, samsara is the world. So this is getting out completely, is the idea here. There's no way sort of to exist within the world without being involved in this cycle. So it's different from what we see. We look to be saved from death, sin, and the devil, so that we can sort of exist more in a greater and better way. But this is to sort of get out. So it's also understood that moksha is the ultimate goal of every self or soul, and it's even viewed as something inevitable, though many cycles of reincarnation may be needed to attain to it. So it's almost this impersonal process almost that they see it as well. Like I said, God reabsorbs everything at the end of the cycle, so they have this idea. What I have pictured here, again, it's hard to get a picture of something like this, but this is what they call the sannyasin, who are renouncers, or these are basically wandering ascetics. This is a big sort of cultural thing within Hinduism, are these sannyasin, and they basically renounce everything and just pursue moksha. So these are the men who have that 4th and greatest desire. So they're very, well, I won't say very common, but you know, they're a big element. So that's why I've pictured them there. So the next thing we have to look at, and this is the main point. So I've just looked at sort of what constitutes what you could say is the general worldview of Hinduism. So you've got Dharma, sort of the way things are, then you have karma and samsara, and moksha. So the interrelationship, that's sort of the worldview, the basic elements that I could identify. But now we have to look on Atman and Brahman. And this is very important, especially covered in the Upanishads, which we talked about earlier. This is sort of the concept that I think ties everything together. This is how I'm going to reconcile these two, the polytheism and the lofty metaphysics. So Atman is usually translated as soul or self, but like I said earlier, it doesn't exactly correspond to our understanding of what a soul is. The Atman is the individual self in each being, and that's any being, including an animal or a plant. And it's, you saw in that picture of reincarnation, it's this one abiding thing through all of these different forms, and those forms can be anything. So it is this self can be reincarnated and manifested as a fish or a god. So it's not like a soul. We would understand a human has a soul, but it's a human soul. It's this integral part of the human nature, which it has to be manifested as a human body, you know. So it's different. So I think self is a better translation than soul in that case. So Brahman is closely related to the concept of Atman, and this is what is often translated as God, Brahman. But it doesn't really correspond to our understanding of God. I've sort of put together what you could call our various definitions, though they would say it's beyond all definition, but this is some of what I found. And this is the stuff that really impressed the British when they started reading these. So, well, first of all, literally it could be translated as something like sacred utterance, or one who is possessed of sacred utterance. That would be a literal translation, but some explanation of what it actually is as they say, it is the eternal substrate of the universe from which Dharma proceeds, eternal being, the creative power or truth, the cosmic principle, absolute reality, the source of the phenomenal world, the unchanging source of change, the soul and self of all, the unseen seer, the unheard hearer, the unthought thinker, the ununderstood understander, the inner controller, the supreme principle, unqualified, beyond all distinctions, absolutely unconditioned, universal manifestation in its entirety being strictly nil beside its infinity. The Supreme Spirit, uncreated, eternal, infinite, transcendent, the all-embracing principle, which comprises in itself both being and non-being, the sole reality, cause, foundation, source, and goal of existence, which manifests itself as the self of all manifested beings in the world, but itself has no attributes. The whole manifested world is dependent upon Brahman and is a mere support for raising oneself to transcendent knowledge. The manifest world is only an application of the principial truth, which is Brahman. It is also said that the world is the dream of Brahman. And it is also said that manifestation, the existence of the world, is the day of Brahman, while non-manifestation is the night. And a quote from the Upanishads, so this is what the British would have been reading. And this is one of their, their ancient hymns. It's just interesting. The one God, hidden in all creatures, pervading all, the inner self of all contingent beings, the overseer of karma, abiding in all creatures, witness, aware, solitary, free from all qualities, the one in whose power are the many, which are themselves incapable of action, who makes the one seed manifold, him do wise men behold as self-subsistent. They, no others, have eternal happiness, eternal among eternals, conscious among conscious beings, one among the many, disposer of desires. He who knows him as the God who is the cause of all, he is released from all fetters. So yes, this is what they found in stark contrast to all of those statues and so forth. So some of this language we would probably use in some of our theological texts, but we do have to note especially that there is absolutely nothing personal about Brahman. Any kind of personal existence is seen as a qualification and a distinction, and therefore cannot in any way be applied. They do have a concept of sort of a one, like monotheistic God that they call Ishwara, but those who profess such a thing also say that in the last estimation, this personality is just a veil over the Brahman. So even that. Now, we heard in some of those phrases that I just threw out for you, if you were paying attention, we heard in some of this that Brahman is called the inner self of all contingent being and manifests itself as the self of all. So this is our connection between Atman and Brahman, and that brings us to our mysterious images here, which I'm sure you've been wondering about. So, according to, this is one perspective, this is sort of the classical Hindu teaching represented by Shankara, who I told you about earlier. They have lots of perspectives, which I can't go into. But basically, moksha, so salvation, what we talked about, consists precisely in this realization that Atman, or self, and Brahman, who is the eternal one, which is the principle of all the many, are actually identical. So they teach that people falsely identify the self, their Atman, with the senses, the body, and the mind, and this is precisely how they are led into the captivity of samsara. So moksha, according to this interpretation, is to discover that the self is not any of those things, but is actually Brahman. And what follows from this is that all things are one. You've probably heard phrases like that before. So some of the common images that they use to describe this is just what we have here. So you have multifarious rivers, stemming all over the place, but they all flow into one sea. So that's probably the most common image that's known to try to describe the many being one. Another one is the bees. They have many particles of pollen, but it's together in one honey. And then another one, and this is from a famous episode that's recorded in one of their scriptures, is he uses the fig tree. Oh no, forgive me, I'm thinking of a different episode, but this is another illustration they use, the fig tree. So he takes a fig, and he takes a seed out of the fruit, and he says, well, the seed, the fruit, the branch, do they not all have the same essence of fig? So it is with Brahman. Another way that you can explain this concept is with geometry. So you're going to get geography, you're going to get geometry. So this is our coordinate plane, as you know. And on our plane, we have a point. Now, the point actually has no measurement and does not partake of space in the strictest sense. You can't, to measure, you have to be able to subdivide into multiple points. So this is, if you try to measure, it's just going to keep getting infinitely smaller. It doesn't actually, it's sort of paradoxical. We have it on our plane there, but it doesn't actually partake of space. Its measurement is 0. But nonetheless, it is the one principle of anything that you would make in geometrical space. So if I extend my point into a line, you get, the point is the principle of that line. And you would find the point in any single part of that line, and yet it's somehow not there, because it'll keep getting smaller and smaller. So you extend the line, you get a two-dimensional shape, and so on. So whatever shape you make, the point is still the principal thing and can be found as the very same point in every shape, in every constituent part of the shape. So the point has the potential to produce every possible geometrical figure, though it is not any of those figures. So it's the same idea with Atman and Brahman. The self, which is understood to be sort of the principal part of any being, is itself, is also found to be identical with all of the other selves, the way that that point is the same point distributed throughout the shapes, the principle. And it's therefore identical with Brahman, which is like the principle of principles. So this is their teaching. So all manifested things in the world, however varied they are just sort of an application or a manifestation of the single unitary principle. Of course, this is obviously within the context of the Hindu tradition supposed to be understood, through much ascetical practice and sort of mystical understanding. So what I've given you here is not that, but I think this account is sufficient for our purposes. Now we have to note at this point that, and you've probably deduced this yourself, but if we understand Brahman to be God, then the Hindus really sort of believe that the world is potentially in God, and the world is sort of an extension or a manifestation of God, even though it sort of has, well, it's confusing in my mind, but it has no exactly substantial existence. But this is basically how they get termed pantheists, though they might dispute that appellation, because it's, like I said, the point does not partake of space, but it's the principle. So that brings us back around to our problem of how do you reconcile that? And you may have already guessed it. But anyways, we viewed the documentary about Hinduism in our comparative religion class, and the narrator, the interviewer, he went to this Hindu village and he met a Hindu intellectual, and he was facing the same problem. He had read something about the scriptures, but then he came and he saw these statues everywhere, and he's like, what's going on? And he asked him, well, how many gods are there? And the Hindu man sort of answered, well, if you like, there are 330 million. Now, what the interviewer didn't know, and which I found interesting, is that he had just walked into a scene taken directly out of the Upanishads. And this will give us some explanation. So there's a seeker who goes up to a sage named Yajnavalkya, and he asks him, how many gods are there? He wants to know. He's seeking. So he tells him, well, there's 3 and 300 and 3 and 3,000. So the seeker says, well, yes, of course. But really, Yajnavalkya, how many gods are there? Well, 33. Yes, of course. But really, Yajnavalkya, how many gods are there? And he says, 6. Yes, of course. But really, how many? Well, 3, 2, 1.5, 1. And he whittles it down that way. So this is sort of our explanation here. It's an integral part of the Hindu outlook that they see all of their many gods, perhaps up to 330 million, as being they're manifestations of the one. So it's this idea of Brahman that I've just been describing to you. So all of the multitude of gods and the various religious understandings that are all sort of under this big umbrella of Hinduism, which is varied in ways that I have not shown you, because for time constraints, they're seen as being essentially one in that way. So they understand that from the highest level, if you see things as being many and different, that is ignorance. But to see the many as being one is freedom and knowledge. So this is quite literally our unifying principle of Hinduism, which we can be very glad to discover. So that's what sort of brings together all of these various things. So another question, or something was brought up in that interview in the documentary we saw. They set up this big festival around the statue that they had built in the village, and it went on for like a whole week. At the end of the festival, they took the statue and threw it in the water. So the British man was very confused. I thought you were idolaters. But they don't actually, there's a distinction to be made, because and the fact that the actual villagers were throwing away the statue argues for this, that it's not just like a philosophical apology that they're making, is that they believe that they're, well, on a certain level, they believe that the gods sort of come and inhabit the image, that sort of like that power comes through the image. So they pay the honor to the image, and their god sort of sees them back or something. But then again, they see through their gods the one. So through the many, the one. So you don't have to accept it, but that's how they reconcile these things. So that's sort of my overview of Hinduism, which I've left out very, very many elements that just I read in my very small amount of research. Like I said, it's thousands of years of tradition, so they've got tons of things. But I want to speak just briefly about what the relation this sort of has to us here in Etna in some way. So, well, first of all, I wanted to make a comment about what I said about moksha being the identification of Atman and Brahman, or if you wanted to translate it, the self and God, identical. This was in a text that we read in our monastery trapeza, and I'm afraid I didn't have time to look it up, so I'm afraid I can't give you an exact citation. I believe it was in a book of Archimandrite Sophronie, perhaps about St. Silouan the Athonite, but I could be wrong. It's one of the more modern Orthodox writers. And he was talking about Eastern religions. And he said about Atman and Brahman, this whole thing, or at least I believe this is what he was talking about. He said that the error of the Eastern religions is that they have very, very rigorous ascetic practices. And he says through these, they behold in themselves the image of God. But then they say that that image within them, this is God. And he said that is spiritual darkness. He said that's the error of the devil, that I am God. So I wanted to make that comment. That's concerning. So I just wanted to add that to say that the whole Hindu scheme is not necessarily just wrong in some of the ways that I've pointed out. Their idea of time or scripture, but it's also very dangerous in this sense. And so their ideas, which have come into our own culture, I'm not going to tell you about the Hare Krishnas, but they're a Hindu group that's international. An American guru, which is probably a more and more common phenomenon. And then a little Russian girl who I guess was converted to some form of Hinduism. I found just examples. This Hindu spirituality is sort of making its way into our culture. So that's what sort of brings it to us. And just to close, I wanted to give a practical application which is interesting for us in particular. So this is Ramakrishna, and that's the temple where I guess he was, I don't know what you would call it, but where he became enlightened. He stayed at that temple. So he lived there in the 19th century and attained to moksha or Hindu enlightenment, I guess. And he became sort of this great sage of India. But interestingly, among other things, he taught the essential equality of all religions. And this brings us to the idea of Brahman again. It just logically follows that there are different manifestations of the same one principle. So he taught that specifically. So this idea of the one and the many. And then he had a disciple named Vivekananda. Very interestingly, came to the West to what was called the World Congress of Religions, I believe. This was the late 19th century in Chicago. World Parliament, forgive me. There he is pictured with Nikola Tesla. which is interesting. I don't know what to say about that. But so there's the parliament there. And this is actually, if I'm not mistaken, understood to be sort of a forerunner of the ecumenical and interfaith movements that we see in the modern day. So I'm not saying that he was this great influential figure. I don't actually know. But you see how these influences are coming in, is sort of the point that I was making there. After he went to the West here, Vivekananda actually gained a bunch of Western disciples, and he ended up founding like this international Ramakrishna mission, and he spreads Hindu teachings. And we actually have one of their books in our library, which I used for this presentation. So I don't know how popular or influential, but that's just to give you an idea. So we come to the end. We end where we began. This is the Indus River. So I guess my closing comment about what I've just said about Hinduism coming into the West is that, and this is just my sort of interpretation, but our sort of many modern attitudes we have in our own culture of things, it's all the same to me, relativism, New Age syncretism, and these things that are represented by the ecumenical movement and interfaith movements, definitely seem to have this sort of Hindu element. Of course, I'm not asserting that everyone who has those opinions is directly influenced by Hinduism, and Hindus have a lot of ideas that would be not agreeable to them. Like, they have very strong ideas about like a hierarchy and things like that. But just these ideas sort of mesh with our modern trends. And it's interesting. This sort of standard, I've already told you this, but what they give is a sort of apologetic when you ask the Hindu philosophers again about the many gods and, you know, isn't this just idolatry? Why don't you say something to them? Is what I told you, which is that the many gods are basically just all names of the one God. The one God is being worshipped through the many, so each person approaches the one God according to whatever way is best for him. So I think this kind of attitude sort of, maybe within a Hindu context, is not identical, but very similar to our sort of modern zeitgeist of what I've said. Or this was at least the impression I got from my research. And I just thought it would be worthy of reflection that there's this sort of commonality between these enlightened Hindus who discover themselves to be essentially the same as God and our modern trends in thinking. I just thought that that was something you could pull from this that's maybe worthy of reflection. So forgive me if I've misspoken, or if any of you are Hindu scholars. I know that you'll have many errors to point out, but this is my presentation. I thank you for your patience. Gita.